Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our storytelling session tonight. I invite you to step into a quiet suburban neighborhood where everything seems picture perfect until the clock strikes 3:03 a.m. In this uncanny community, every resident enjoys a strange streak of good fortune. But there is one unbreakable rule: never look at the figure who whistles softly along the street each night when a visiting boy ignores the warning. A terrifying night of knocking and tapping ensues, forcing everyone to confront the dark secret behind their seemingly charmed lives, prepare for a suspenseful tale of curiosity, consequences, and the price of forbidden knowledge. Night after night, no matter the forecast, something wanders our streets softly whistling. You'll only notice it if you happen to be in the living room or kitchen when it glides by, always right at 3:03 in the morning. The notes start off faint somewhere near the Carson house at the far end, then drift past our place in the middle and finally fade away near the cul-de-sac. When I was little, my sister and I sometimes snuck into the kitchen after lights out just to listen. Mom and Dad disapproved big time, but never punished us too harshly. They only insisted on one unbreakable rule: never try to see whoever or whatever is doing the whistling. Our neighborhood is an odd but charming place. I've lived here since I was 6, and it has grown on me. Houses may be small, but they well kept with spacious yards where everyone can explore. I turned 13 last October, and there are plenty of kids my age around. We used to play foursquare in the cul-de-sac or hop between back porches in the summer. It's a great area to grow up in if you ignore the two strange things that come with it: the whistling at night and the curious good luck that seems to hang over our block. Honestly, the whistling never really bothered me. Like I said, it doesn't reach my bedroom, but my parents hate talking about it, so I've learned not to ask. My dad is tall and calm. He has a slight accent because he moved here from the islands when he was young along with my grandparents. He only loses his composure if someone brings up the whistler. When his words come faster, his eyes dart a bit, and he reminds us of the one guideline, the big rule: don't ever try to peek when the whistler passes. Not that we could see anything even if we wanted to. Dad's installed stout canvas shutters inside every window, heavy sheets that pull down from the top and latch at the bottom. Each latch has a tiny lock like the kind you'd find on a diary. He secures them every night before bed and keeps the key in his room. Mom, I am not quite sure how she feels about it all. Once in a while, I've noticed her sitting in the living room at exactly 3:03. I've spied her through a crack in my bedroom door. She isn't there often, maybe once or twice a month, but on those nights she'll sit on our big red couch just listening. The whistler's tune is always the same. Strangely enough, it sounds happy. You remember I mentioned two peculiar things about this place I call home. We've already covered the nighttime whistler. The second is that practically everyone who lives in this neighborhood has incredible luck. It's weird to talk about, and Dad isn't crazy about us discussing it, but remarkable things happen here all the time, mostly small stuff like winning random giveaways, landing sudden pay raises, or digging up genuine arrowheads in your own backyard. The weather's usually pleasant. Crime is virtually non-existent, and each autumn the gardens seem to burst with color. Mom calls it a million little blessings, but the biggest reason we stayed here and why we moved here in the first place is my sister Nola. She was born with serious lung issues. In the beginning, we couldn't even bring her home from the hospital. She was so tiny that they had to put her on a machine just to keep her breathing. Once we moved to this neighborhood to be closer to the hospital, though Nola started improving, the doctors couldn't figure it out. They attributed it to their own treatments, but all of us could see they were stumped. Even I knew it was just one more in a long line of quiet miracles that happen around here. That's why we decided to stay, even after we learned the flip side of these small wonders. Sometimes, though rarely, bad things happen around here too, and they only come for people who try to see what's behind the whistler. We have a welcoming committee in this neighborhood. Whenever someone new arrives, 4 friendly folks appear at the door with a casserole, a gift basket, and a manila envelope. 7 years ago, when we moved in, they dropped by, made polite conversation, handed me a Snickers, and took turns cuddling baby Nola. She had just gotten out of the hospital, so they were extra gentle. Afterward, they asked to speak privately with my parents, so I got sent to my room, but I still managed to eavesdrop. They told Mom and Dad how unbelievably wonderful the neighborhood was, and then explained something harder to swallow. Every single morning at exactly 3:03, a faint whistling drifts by, ending at 3:05. Our new neighbors assured my parents that the sound itself was harmless provided we never tried to find its source. They emphasized this point. I pressed my ear to the door and heard them describe people who'd gone snooping after the whistler. Their fortunes took a dark turn. It was as if a heavy malevolent cloud followed them everywhere, and anything that could fail did. The manila folder they brought was filled with newspaper clippings about ruined lives, freakish accidents, and tragic deaths. Not everyone dies, the committee's leader said to Dad, but you can see the light go out of them. They might still walk around, but it's like they've lost their spark. My mom wasn't buying any of it. She accused the committee of playing some cruel prank or discriminating against us because my father is from the islands. Dad calmed her down. He told her he could sense they were being sincere, that he grew up hearing tales about strange forces in the world, some good, some bad, and some just different. After the committee left, Dad headed to the hardware store. He came back with thick canvas shades latches and small locks which he installed on every window right after dinner that very first night in our new house. I snuck out of my bedroom at 3 in the morning and found Dad awake in the living room holding Nola. He gestured for me to be quiet and beckoned me over to the couch. At exactly 3:03 we heard the whistling. It appeared and disappeared exactly the way our neighbors promised. The whistling arrived each and every night without fail, and we never peeked, not once, and in exchange we got to enjoy our million little blessings every single day. Nola can now breathe on her own, and she has blossomed into a bright, resourceful girl. My father eventually became part of the welcoming committee himself. We rarely see newcomers around here, after all, who in their right mind would choose to move away, but whenever a fresh family does take up residence, Dad and the committee greet them with a macaroni casserole, a warm gift basket, and that ominous manila folder. I can always tell from my dad's expression when he comes home whether the newcomers believe the committee's warnings or whether we'll soon see a for sale sign in their yard. Not too long ago a family moved into the house directly next door to ours. The previous resident, Ms. Maddie, had passed away at the ripe old age of 105. She lived a long, full life. Our new neighbors seemed poised to fit right in. They listened to the welcoming committee's instructions, heeded my dad's advice about securing the shutters each evening, especially since they had a small child of their own. We never got to see the exact articles and evidence tucked away in that manila folder, but whatever was in there must have been strikingly persuasive. They followed all of the rules for a month with no problems at all. Then came the night the new neighbors had to take a short trip out of town. They decided to leave their son Holden with us. He was 12, a grade below me, and though I didn't know him well before that evening, the instant his parents dropped him off after dinner, I got a bad feeling in my gut. "Do you know who keeps up that whistling every night?" Holden asked practically the moment the adults stepped out the door. The three of us, my sister Holden and I, were in our den. A Disney movie was playing quietly on the television, more background noise than entertainment. My sister and I exchanged a wary look. "We don't talk about that," I answered. Holden grinned, as if he found our caution amusing. "I bet it's that weird guy in the big yellow house on the corner," he said. "You mean Mr. Tolles?" my sister asked. "He's not weird at all, he's super nice." Holden shrugged casually. "Then maybe he's a psycho killer." Hearing that, Nola stiffened. "We don't talk about it," I repeated a bit more firmly this time. "Let us just hang out in my room and play some Nintendo." So that's what we did for the next few hours, taking turns with video games, munching on popcorn, and eventually switching to random movies. It felt like a perfectly normal sleepover, except I couldn't help noticing how restless Holden seemed as the night wore on. After my parents stopped by to wish us good night, made sure all the blinds were locked, and finally went to bed, Holden got up from his bean bag and walked over to where Nola and I were perched on my bed. "You've never even tried to look outside?" he asked. "You know, it's almost time." Like many sleepovers, we had conveniently overlooked any idea of bedtime. I glanced at my alarm clock and realized he was right. It was creeping up on 3 in the morning. I sighed. "We don't I can Holden interrupted me as though I hadn't spoken at all. "My dad locks our blinds at night and hides the key, so I've never even gotten the chance to try." "That's exactly what our dad does," Nola added. Holden shook his head. "No," he said simply, "no, he doesn't." I stared at him, taken aback. "You literally watched him do it?" "He always does." But Holden's grin only widened. "Sure, he locks them, but he doesn't hide the key. He leaves it on his regular key ring." My stomach twisted. I had noticed on some level that Dad no longer bothered hiding the special key. After all these years, it was second nature for us to follow the rules, so I guess he just grew lax. "Anyway," Holden continued breezily, "after your dad locked the windows and before your parents went to sleep, I pretended I had to use the bathroom on my way. I might have peeked into their room and noticed the key ring on your dad's nightstand, and then I might have borrowed the key to the blinds." Nola and I both stared at him in disbelief as his smirk grew more confident. "You lying?" I said, my voice low. Holden shrugged again, perfectly calm. "Go see for yourself. Open your parents' door a crack. You'll spot the key ring sitting right there, the blind key, 1TB on it." I was torn, but finally I said, "Stay here, don't move." I wanted to confirm whether he was telling the truth or not. Sneaking over to my parents' bedroom, I hesitated in the doorway. If Holden was telling the truth, Dad would be furious beyond furious if he caught me, but the alternative was worse. The idea that one of our windows might be unlocked. When the whistler passed by, holding my breath, I eased the door open just an inch. The room was almost pitch dark, so I couldn't see anything. I worked up the nerve to step inside. After taking only 2 steps, I froze. The whistling had begun. I realized with a start that it was so clear, so close. I could hear it right there in my parents' room, and in that moment it hit me that Mom and Dad must have listened to that eerie tune every night since we moved here. They simply never told us. Maybe they thought it would frighten us too much. I stood there uncertain whether to flip on the lights or wake Dad. Then I heard movement out in the living room, something that snapped me out of my stupor. "Nola!" I shouted, sprinting out of my parents' room. When I got to the living room, I saw Holden and Nola huddled by the front door next to one of the windows. Holden hadn't been bluffing, he was fiddling with the latch on the shutters. I heard a soft click, he definitely had the key. He gave a short, triumphant laugh. Nola was beside him, appearing simultaneously terrified and a little intrigued, and that slow, haunting whistle was right outside our house. I am not sure if I shouted or just gasped. I can hardly remember. Time seemed to slow down, like some cosmic pause button had been pressed, but I managed to force myself forward, covering the distance between me and Nola in a heartbeat. I kept my eyes locked on her. In the background, I heard the blinds slide all the way down and snap back up, and I knew the whistling was just outside that unsealed window. I threw my arms around Nola, pivoting her, so she wouldn't be able to see the outside. At the same moment, I squeezed my own eyes shut. The blind whipped open with a swift crack. Instantly, the whistling went silent. I felt Nola trembling in my arms. "Dante, look okay," I whispered urgently. "Dante, turn around." We were now standing so she faced back into the hallway, while I was still turned toward the window, eyes clamped shut. She nodded against my shoulder, letting me know she understood. With my free arm, I reached out, trying to grab Holden. My fingers brushed against his arm, and I realized he was shaking even worse than Nola. "Holden," I called softly. Nothing but silence. I stretched out my arm, feeling my way along the window with my eyes clamped shut. The glass felt unnaturally cold for that time of year. As my fingers traveled upward, searching for the pull cord, I noticed the glass was getting warmer the higher my hand went, and I sensed a faint vibrating hum beneath my fingertips. I forced myself not to imagine what was right on the other side. Eventually my fingers found the cord, and I yanked the blinds closed. Then I opened my eyes. In the weak light spilling in from the kitchen, I could make out Holden, white as a sheet, small and tense, gazing at the window I had just covered. "Holden," I asked again. He spun toward me and screamed. All at once the house exploded with activity. Lights flared in the hall, then in the living room. I heard my parents rushing across the hardwood floor, but I couldn't bear to look away from Holden. His lips were cracked and bleeding, like he'd bitten down too hard, and a thin trail of blood trickled from his chin. He'd also wet himself. "What happened?" my dad demanded from somewhere behind me. I managed to pull my gaze from Holden and look over my shoulder. "He looked," I said, my heart racing. I had never in my life seen true fear on my dad's face, but in that moment I witnessed something old and terrible flicker across his features, a raw parental dread. "Just Holden," he mouthed. I gave a quick nod. Dad let out a long breath. Relief flooded his eyes so strongly I almost expected him to cheer. Then he turned to look at Holden, and I noticed guilt cloud his expression, like he felt bad for being relieved. It was only Holden who had looked. A sharp knock sounded at the door. All of us froze in place. Holden let out a trembling whimper. "Dante, open it," my mom said firmly. She stood at the mouth of the hallway gripping a baseball bat. I'd always assumed she was more skeptical than Dad about the whistler, and the blinds apparently that night changed everything. I realized both my parents held bats they must have grabbed from their bedroom. Another knock followed, louder than before. "Please, Dante, open the door," Holden whispered again, tears in his voice. My dad stepped toward him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "We won, T," he promised, still keeping one hand on his bat. "Nothing is getting in here tonight." Thud, thud, thud. The pounding this time rattled the door in its frame. Holden shrieked, and Nola clung to me in terror. My mom knelt next to us, wrapping her arms around us both. Thud, thud, thud. "Call the police," my mom whispered toward Dad. Suddenly the banging stopped dead. Dad glanced over his shoulder at all of us. "Do you think?" Before he could finish, a frantic barrage of knocks erupted, trailing off into a suspiciously polite tap, tap, tap. "Police," said a voice on the other side of the door. It sounded just like my mom's voice, but hollow and wrong, almost as if it were mimicking her. "Police, call the police," it repeated in a monotone, tapping the door with each word police. Mom's hold on us tightened. "Police, police, police, police. Please stop," I heard her whisper. "I don't think calling them would help," my dad said softly. "If we did, how would we know it was really them at the door?" The knock suddenly came back, more ferociously, shaking the door until I worried the wood might split. Holden screamed again, and I felt Nola's arms dig deeper around my waist. Then, without warning, the pounding switched to the back door. We turned as one toward the kitchen, but almost the instant we looked, the thumping returned to the front door, front to back, back to front, loud and then soft and then loud again, and then came more knocking on the window. Soon it sounded like a furious drumming on every side of the house. I had a mental image of some enormous creature hammering on a turtle's shell, trying to crack it open. "Stop," Holden shouted into the chaos. Everything quieted. "I won't tell," Holden said, staring at the door with wet eyes. "I promise I won't tell anyone what I saw. Just go away." For a moment we all listened in the hush, then we heard it, a delicate tap, tap, tap on the same window Holden had dared to peek through. Holden broke into sobs, crying, As if he were a prisoner watching gallows being built outside his cell, my dad held him close and stroked his hair, but he didn't offer empty reassurances. He didn't say it would be okay. The soft tapping continued at that window for the rest of the night. We stuck together in the living room. I am not sure how many hours. At one point my mom tried to lead us kids down the hall to my bedroom while Dad kept watch, but the moment we moved away from that central spot, the pounding returned so violent I thought the door might shatter. We hurried back, and immediately it sank back down to that faint but persistent tap 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 at the window. None of us slept at all that night. The tapping finally ceased around 7 in the morning, which is usually about sunrise. We waited nearly 2 more hours before Dad went to check the blinds. First, he made us stay in my parents' bedroom away from the windows or doors. I heard the blinds being lifted, heard him open the front door, then he came back. Okay, he said, sounding exhausted. It's done. Holden's parents arrived around midday. Mom and Dad escorted Holden home and spent a long time talking with his family inside their house. Nola and I watched through our window, sticking close to each other, occasionally holding hands. By the time my parents returned, it was well into the afternoon. They both looked grim, and neither would discuss what they told Holden's mom and Dad it happened to be a Sunday, so we ordered pizza and spent the rest of the day together like we needed to reassure ourselves we were still a normal family. That night we all slept in my bedroom, Nola and Mom in my bed, Dad in a padded chair. He dragged in from the living room. There was no knocking, and the nights that followed were quiet again. We scarcely saw Holden or his parents the rest of that week. Then on Thursday a moving truck showed up in their driveway, and they spent the afternoon loading it up. The part one remember most vividly is how exhausted they looked, the entire family pale with hollow distant gazes. Even from across the street I could see they were weighed down by something heavy and unspoken. Just before sunset they were gone. I recalled what the welcoming committee had told my folks when we first arrived. Not everyone who catches a glimpse of the Whistler dies, but for those who live, the light inside them goes out, and their days become a string of tragedies, a million little disasters. Sometimes I think Holden's parents must have taken a look too. Maybe they did it to reassure him or to share his burden if they believed it. I watch Nola, sometimes thinking of how alive and joyful she is. I wonder if on that night I had been a second slower, would she have looked out that window? And if she had, would I have done the same just to be there for her? I am grateful I didn't have to make that choice. We still live in that same house in the same neighborhood, and we still hear the Whistler shuffling past every single night, but the blessings here, the luck, the good fortune, we can walk away from them. We just take extra precautions. We no longer invite friends to stay overnight, and my dad now hides that blinds key so thoroughly I couldn't find it if I tried. Not that I would. Some things you learn you never want to look for. Subscribe to the channel and like the video so you don't miss new videos.